Hi, folks. Welcome to Class 7 of PA Theory. Should government be run like a business? This class builds on many of the ideas that we have talked about in the past and is, I would say, a very important element of where we are today in the US and also many other parts of the world. So, this way of thinking about running a government like a business has really become a trend since the 1980s, primarily from the Reagan era. And as we discussed in the previous class, this is the term used to describe this way of thinking is new public management, where new is supposedly a new way of imagining the role of government and businesses and how they are supposed to work together. So we look at what this idea is and what the basic principles are. We'll also critique some of this and also look at placing these concepts that are at the core of this philosophy, which is efficiency and accountability, and see how these ideas have actually come from the business world and have moved to the government, and interestingly, have also made their way into the world of nonprofits. So, nonprofit management also increasingly has these elements. So, in effect, this is a very influential philosophy which one cannot ignore, even if one dislikes it, or if one is a fan, then of course you have to study this. So, just a quick backdrop in terms of the history of where these ideas came from. As I said, in the 1980s, there was a lot of movement towards understanding how to make governments more efficient, more responsive to people, and there were a lot of commissions, reports written, a lot of commissions established, including during Reagan era, and of course continued on with Bill Clinton, who had his own welfare reform initiatives, and of course even during Obama's administration, this has continued. So it's like a onward march, regardless of whether it's a Republican or Democratic government. So in many ways, it's a bipartisan idea, if you will, and there are lots of interesting studies that have looked at both the positives and negatives of what this way of thinking has brought up. So essentially, the core idea here is to reduce the welfare state, as in to reduce food stamps, to reduce any sort of unemployment benefits as much as we can, to increase privatization and devolution of services from the state to individuals and local communities. So the idea being that the state is not there to babysit people, and people should be responsible and grow up and take care of themselves. So that's sort of the very crass way of putting this idea into a few words. And interestingly, since the early 2000s onwards, there has also been, with the growth of internet, growth of outsourcing and other technologies or ways of living, this has contributed to it in enormously complicated ways in terms of reducing wages, all the kinds of problems, rising inequality, and all those things that we talk about have been very, very impactful in this space. So here's a comparison chart I found, which I think captures some of the questions or problem areas, and what is the approach taken here, and what is the history behind it. So pause this for a few minutes, if you will. Pause this video and have a look at this and see how much of this you're familiar with. So if something is not clear, of course, during our discussion, we can discuss those ideas. But pretty much, I think many of the questions and terms or approaches are pretty self-explanatory here. And of course, we'll discuss this. But I think this is an illustrative chart that explains the move from really from the first question, which is how can we put government to an orderly, efficient footing, to the most recent one, which is how can we make government more responsive to citizens. So I think it's an interesting chart to look at. Here's an interesting TED talk I came across. So please, again, pause this video and use your PowerPoint to go to this talk and come back to my talk after that TED talk. So back to new public management, we talked about the fiscal crisis of 1970s giving rise to austerity measures. This happened pretty much in the US as well as UK, with Margaret Thatcher leading these reforms. And also, there was a lot of social and economic and political changes that were happening around this time, with again the growth of technology and computer technology and microprocessors increasing the speed and all kinds of things. And Joseph Nye, he's an important scholar. He mentions three forces that have led to the decentralization rather, of economies: globalization, marketization, and information revolution. Each one, in a very complicated way, has given rise to new public management and, in both positive and negative ways, impacted our world. Now, David Osborne is a very influential scholar. I mean, I don't think he's a scholar. He's a thinker who's written a very influential book, which became very, very influential in shaping federal government in the U.S. So please have a look at his talk, and I've also included one of his readings in today's session. So this is all about how do you rethink government and reshape the way it works. So back to a comparison between old public administration, new public management, and new public service. We talked about new public service in the previous class of what can be a better way to manage our systems of administration. So in the old public administration, we just look at a few of these bullet points here. So the theoretical foundation was political theory and some sort of social sciences in the old public administration. New public management became more positivistic, as in more use of empirical data and economic theory and sort of more quantification of measures and efficiencies and accountability and sort of evaluating how things went. So Denhart and Denhart, who you've studied, they argue that there needs to be more democratic participation of people, more inclusion of people. So that's the new public service model that they are arguing for. Let's look at to whom are civil servants responsive, point number 4. So in the old public administration, it was the clients and constituents. In the new public management, it's the customers. So treat a client as a customer. And in new public service, Denhart and Denhart are asking us to think of people as citizens, meaning people with active constitutional rights, or global rights, human rights in a global context. So these are some, again, pause this video for a few minutes and look at each of these carefully and look at what distinction you can draw between column number 1, 2, and 3 and why this is important and what it means for the way we live, for the way we carry on our business of administration. So, is running a government good, bad, or ugly? That's a question that I have formulated. Now, this is a paradox in the sense that there is increasing public-private partnerships. With this current administration with Trump, it's like you don't know what's going on because he is a businessman who's benefiting personally from a lot of the government connections and, of course, his own position and his family, making a mockery of the Emoluments Act and other ethical standards. So here is a classic example of how that can go wrong. However, there is also the fact that governments can become efficient. So again, to the credit of those who say we need to make government efficient, of course. I mean, there are areas where you should make government a little business-like. You need to have faster service. You need to have treat people better. Of course, you can't argue with those things. However, you cannot put an economic value on democratic participation, equity, and justice. So that's one of the big arguments here, saying you cannot undo or you cannot ignore the value of democratic participation at the risk of emphasizing greater efficiency. So that's what I've been using the example of constructing a road. So there, in that very example, if you're emphasizing or prioritizing efficiency, then you're ignoring democratic participation. So these are roughly some of the ideas, and there are some resources here for you guys to read. But I hope you enjoyed the readings, and I look forward to discussing these with you, and also taking these key ideas forward. Thank you.